This video is probably not going where you think it's going to go. If we're going to talk about discipline, let's get on the same page here. A lot of people think about discipline in one way, and that is basically punishing or doing something to correct a child, mostly using chastising or punishing. And that is a definition of discipline. However, that is not how you discipline your children. Disciplining a child, really what that comes down to is, first, what is the purpose behind disciplining a child? Why would you even want to discipline a child? I think if you talk to most parents, they would say because, not just because they want them to behave a certain way, although that is the answer that a lot of folks will give, because they're looking at how their kid is going to reflect on them in society, which is another point completely aside. Why are you worried about what society thinks about you? But more importantly is they want their children to do well in society. They want their children to do well in some sense. And so a lot of times people will use discipline in the sense of just getting along in society and behaving in a certain way, but they're missing the entire point of discipline. That point being, discipline is really about instruction. It's really about having the ability to do or create whatever it is that you set out to do because you are disciplined, because you're willing to work on this with diligence, willing to work on anything at all, whether that be specifically math instruction, reading instruction, or any sort of skill at all that you want to be good at. A lot of kids think they want to be YouTubers today, and that's not a coincidence. That's because they're influenced very heavily by YouTube, and so everyone thinks that they'll just become a YouTuber. In the past, kids wanted to be like astronauts or firefighters or whatever it is that you want to become. You will have to be disciplined in order to do that. Jim Rohn says discipline is a creative force. And that's really interesting because if you actually look at what discipline is, it is the route to getting or becoming and doing everything that you want. Meaning discipline in the sense of being instructed in the proper way and doing that thing effectively every single time, all the time, and consistently. And so discipline would be, in essence, how to discipline your child is teaching them diligence, teaching them how to stay at a task, how to properly approach a task. If you're not properly approaching a task, you're not disciplined in that task. If you're not effective in it, you're not disciplined in it. They call many things disciplines, like playing a musical instrument or being an artist with like paints or any sort of medium, really. Writing, there's so many different things that are called the disciplines because you have to be disciplined in order to do it. Meaning you have to show up and you have to do it correctly and you have to continue doing that and be consistent with it in order for it to sound or look or create the effect that you want to create. Now, consider this. You are disciplined. Even you listening to this who may think, well, I'm not that disciplined. You're disciplined in something. You're disciplined either in doing the thing that you want to effectively, or you're disciplined in not doing it. Consider that. Meaning you're disciplined in not what you're instructed in, what you've learned, what your ability is in, what your skill is in not focusing on things. But you can change that to be instructed and skilled and develop diligence towards and consistency toward doing something that is effective or doing it until you are effective. And so how you develop that with your child is, one, they have to actually be able to understand you. If you want to do this the right way, meaning without punishing them, and you don't have to punish your child in order for them to be effective, in order for them to understand how society's rules work and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. You don't have to punish your children in order for them to understand those things. In fact, the punishment is really just a way to get their attention. For a lot of adults, they'll use it to get their attention and stall them from doing some action, but it places a lot of fear within your child. And so your child's making decisions out of fear as opposed to understanding. And then usually what happens after punishment is the parent will explain why they punished them or why what they did was wrong or whatever. Or sometimes they'll explain beforehand, but it seems like it's not getting through to them, and then they'll punish them to force them to quote unquote understand. But again, they're not doing it out of understanding. They're doing it because if they don't, you punish them, and they more fear that punishment rather than understanding why it makes sense to do or not do whatever activity it is. So you don't want to discipline them in that way. If you want to actually discipline them so that they are very effective in this world, then you need to help them to understand actually. And that starts with vocabulary instruction, making sure they have a grand vocabulary, a vast vocabulary, a large vocabulary, so that they can actually comprehend what you're saying. If they only understand 2 words, yes and no, you're not going to get very far with explaining anything else. If all they can understand is yes or no, or I don't know, I like, don't like, that's not going to help them to actually understand advanced concepts beyond just pointing at what's immediately in front of them. Also, they're not going to be able to understand beyond what's immediately in front of them, meaning beyond the decision that they're making, how their decisions are affecting future decisions that they'll make. So that's number 1. Number 2, they have to have an environment where they're allowed to sort of play around with the discipline, with whatever skill they're cultivating, with whatever it is that they're working with. They need to be able to play around with it and really focus in on it, which is something you don't get at school. At school, every hour or hour and a half, depending on the school, whatever, is broken up where you're doing this and then beep, a bell rings, now you go do this. You can no longer sit here focused on this thing. Now you must change and move and do something completely different. That is terrible for developing a child's discipline, because what that does is it sort of breaks down the attention span of that child. And we're seeing this, of course, not just in school, but in TV shows, in movies, in the social media. Things become shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And that is, again, detrimental to anyone's ability to actually focus for any duration of time, long duration of time, so that they can really understand what it is that they're creating and do some what's called deep work. There's a book written about it, but it's essentially the concept that you can go really shallow on a topic for a short amount of time, but when you spend a lot of time focusing on a topic, you can go into this sort of flow state and get a lot of really great creative ideas and a lot of great work done in a certain amount of time. Once you've been working, let's say it takes an hour to get into this deep work state, or maybe in some cases 4 hours, but you can get much more effective, profound, creative work and results from spending that time going deep on something versus the 5 minutes you might spend here, or just an hour you might spend here, or 30 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever. You can actually really get in the zone and produce something amazing and beautiful. And that's really what's required in order to develop the skill set or the discipline itself, where it's almost like what you're disciplining, what you're creating is your body to automatically respond in the ways that you want it to respond. I remember I was watching a juggler. I was watching a juggler one time, and I was noticing like he's throwing up the balls and he's catching them, and every once in a while he would drop a ball, but he was spending, I don't know exactly how long he was out there, but he was out there for a long time. I would look over and he was out there for over an hour juggling these balls. I was reading a book out while I was camping, and I could see him at another campsite just juggling and just being really diligent about it. And I noticed that every time he would drop the ball, it was as if what he was learning was, oh, okay, so I can throw it up this high, But if I place my hand here, just slightly to this side or to that side, then I miss. And so he's disciplining himself or instructing himself, educating himself on exactly how much, what's the limit of an effective juggle. That's essentially what you're doing when you discipline yourself. You're teaching yourself, your body and your mind, what is effective and what is not. But if you're not given the opportunity to do that and really for it to become automatic, you're never going to get to the place where you are just super effective, where you can do it without even thinking about it, where you can really use this discipline as sort of a foundation, where now you have the opportunity to get really, really creative. Because if you don't know how to hold a brush and do a proper brush stroke, you're not going to be able to create the image that maybe you see in your mind, the image that you may have coming forth through you. It's not going to translate well on the paper because you haven't trained yourself to do so. And in the same way, if we look at this world, and I always want to bring it back to this point because this is the reason for being. The reason for doing everything is to create a world that is best for all, because we're not there yet. And we have the resources to do it. We have the mental energy. We have within us all, don't we all want to create a world? Or maybe perhaps just you listening to this and me, but I know there are others. Don't you want to create a world where everyone has their needs met, where no one has to starve? Isn't that what all these charities are about? Isn't that what all these like initiatives, these foundations, all these things, even like, you look at things like, what is that? The pink ribbon for cancer. Their stated purpose is to do research for a cure for cancer. We want to take away people's suffering. We want to live in a world where no one has to endure this type of suffering that is preventable. And we have the resources to do so. And we want to make the best use of those resources. In order to do that, we have to develop or discipline ourselves to create ourselves to the point where we can do these things without having to think about it in the same way. Meaning, if we're so focused on just trying to survive, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're so focused on just trying to survive, how do you get beyond that? Well, first, your survival needs have to be met. So if you're not eating, if you don't have enough to eat, how are you going to think beyond just being able to eat? If you don't have a safe place to sleep, if you're constantly fighting off diseases, nutritional deficiencies, or sanitary diseases, then how are you going to get to the place where you can think even of others? Where you can get to the place where you can spread what you've been given. The basic needs just have to be met first. And so what would be best is disciplining your child to understand, just as an inherent understanding, the principles of doing what is best for all. Because if you're still having a debate within yourself of, does it make sense to do what's best for all? You're not disciplined in that. It's not automatic. Discipline develops. Because of discipline, you can develop yourself to be the very best. But all of us have been disciplined to be essentially consumers. That's essentially what we've all been disciplined, because it benefits the system, it benefits the few who make a lot of money, a lot of profit from it, but ultimately it's destroying us altogether as a people and as a whole. So how to develop discipline for your child? Give them the principles of what is best for all, and give them the education to actually understand what that means and how to do it, and the space and the environment so they can focus on their discipline of creating themselves to be the very best that they can actually be. They're not going to get that at school. I would suggest that if you really want them to be effective in this, to actually make it as the very best that they can be, then you'd want to surround yourself with other people who are doing this as well. And we have a group of other people who are doing this as well. And if you want to know more about that group, you want to plug into that group, reach out, send me a message. There's a link in the description where you can send me a message and say, hey, I want to know more about this group. Send me that message and I'll get you plugged in, and I'll show you how you can educate your kids, and you can talk to other parents who are already doing this with their own kids, and you can create that environment for your children to actually be their very best, actually become disciplined, actually create society to be a reflection of who we are. But if we don't discipline ourselves to produce that, then we're gonna keep getting more of what we are disciplined for, which is a lot of consumerism, which is turning into us consuming our society, us consuming this earth. And we all know where that leads. So let's pump the brakes on that. Let's discipline ourselves. Let's actually create a world that we can make it happen.